We are so excited to share today's conversation with Bryony Cole, who is a force of nature in this space. She burst onto this scene about 5 years ago with her Future of Sex podcast, her global speaking, and now her sex school. And what was so fascinating to me, Allysa, was she talked about having this feeling, or that young girls are taught to make themselves smaller, whether it's physically or emotionally or in terms of volume or presence. And she is the opposite of that. She walks into a room, you can't help but pay attention. She gets on the screen, you can't help but lock your eyes on her. And she is the opposite of small. She makes a statement, and she, as she says, she takes up space and demands to be heard. And it really has been effective, not only for her businesses, but for the category overall to move it forward.
I couldn't agree more. She's dynamic, and just to think about the comfort level that she is bringing to the world of sex tech and sexuality for women all over the world is really amazing. Her conversation is going to resonate because I see so many patients day in and day out with sexual concerns, many of them about sexual drive or loneliness, or where are they going to find their partners now during a pandemic. So I'm hoping she's going to address all of this.
One of the things she does talk about a lot is the power of technology or sex tech to do one of two things. It could bring us closer together, or it could send us further apart. And one of the things she said that I found fascinating is, there's no replacement right now for the human touch. We're using technology, whereas I think a year ago we would have said technology separates us. In many cases, now it's our only form of connection. So we're using it to connect, but there's still something missing in a world where so many people have to spend so much time alone because of the realities of living in this time.
Couldn't agree more. There's an old study showing that couples that live apart and have long distance relationships have an easier time of remaining very excited about each other because, absence makes the heart grow fonder. But this year has really been a test and trial of time away. I think talking to her about seeing, touching, feeling partners versus virtual reality or technology that makes you feel like you're really with somebody is going to be a super interesting conversation. Welcome to the Business of the V. Hello, friends and colleagues. I'm Dr. Allysa Dweck.
And I'm Rachel Braun-Sherrill. Each week, we bring you the most fascinating investors, inventors, entrepreneurs, academics, and healthcare practitioners who are making things happen in women's sexual and reproductive health.
If you are a woman, know a woman, have a business, or care about your V health and wellness, fasten your seatbelts and listen in to another informative and inspiring episode.
We are so delighted to welcome our guest today, Bryony Cole, who has so many different titles and so many different experiences, and is full of passion and personality as it relates to everything, but specifically female health. Welcome, Bryony. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
So much has happened since you started. You sort of stumbled into sex tech, which you want to hear about. You've been referred to as a sex tech storyteller. You have a podcast. Now you have a school. How did you get here?
Yeah, I know. It's been a bit of a stumbling journey. I don't think that stumbling ever stopped. I started with the podcast exploring how sex and technology were, intersecting and mingling, and all what I thought I was going to be talking about was robots. When, I think everyone thinks that when they think about sex and technology, and soon discovered that actually it's so much more than that, and it has to relate to our health and how we use technology to enhance our health or our education around sex, even obviously our pleasure and orgasms, but our identity and the way we express ourselves in the world. And from that podcast birthed an event series. I ended up spending a couple of years just speaking on the topic on the speaker circuit in tech conferences and culture and ideas festivals. And when the pandemic hit, it kind of took on a new life, because suddenly we were all faced with this idea that we're using technology to connect as a means of intimacy, whether it was like we are now through video, or, you know, maybe using technology to monitor our health, or to be intimate, you know, and using toys or those sorts of things. It was sort of in everyone's lives. And that was really interesting for me, because it birthed this school where I you know, teach entrepreneurs how to build prototypes and launch their own businesses based on their own needs. But also just looking at how much media this industry now has attracted, because
we joke we've been 10 years, it's taken us 10 or 20 years to be an overnight sensation.
I know, yeah. This overnight success thing takes, a decade.
It's so interesting what you said about intimacy, because having done a lot of work in trends in the past, the technology was credited with removing technology, removing connectivity, removing relationships, having people be much more self-involved. In fact, we were doing some research on frequency of sex, and one of the reasons given for what they saw was a decline in sex, which they defined as male-female penetrative intercourse. So we're talking about a narrow group, was because people are spending a lot of times on their phone, either engaging in porn or doing whatever else it is they do that's a solo exercise. But I want to go back one step further, and I want to say, before Future of Sex podcast, you said you stumbled onto so many people in this space, identify a problem, look for a solution, don't see one, and create a solution for themselves that turns out to be applicable to a lot of other people. Your journey was a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply, no one was talking about it. You know, in a way, I'd come from a tech background. I was working in startups, and I ended up at Microsoft through that journey, and felt like, wow, technology is so interesting. It infiltrates every other part or room of the house, right? The office, our social lives, and it was affecting our bedroom. But of course, no one talks about sex because it's taboo. So that was really where I found my thing, where I was like, well, here's a need. And of course, I think anyone that stays in this industry, you have to have that personal story as well, because it's such a hard industry to be in. And for me, it was, you know, not a traumatic thing. It was a fairly average upbringing, fairly average sex education, fairly average explanation of everything under that umbrella of sex for me, that really frustrated me as a young girl, and made me feel like I think most young girls do, is like, I have to be small, whether that was like small in stature as soon as I developed breasts, or, you know, bigger body, or small in voice and not speak up in class or at university, and then later on in boardrooms. And so it was this confluence for me of like, no one's talking about this, and I'm actually fed up and I wanted to have a voice, that got me there. And then sort of I've got the staying power, because I so believe in like future generations of young girls having to have a voice and be taking up space and take up a ton of space. And so that's sort of the passion that keeps me in the game now.
I love hearing that, especially since I'm a small woman, you know, physically speaking.
Yeah.
So in my practice as a gynecologist, I am always amazed at the anxiety and angst that the US population places on sex. And clearly you are, you know, universal and worldly when it comes to this field. So what do you think is the issue with the US? Why are we so uptight about this?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't even know if I'd blame the US, because I grew up in Australia and it was kind of similar. And anywhere I go in the world to do these talks, you know, they'll pack a room, but no one will ask a question, because they're still so nervous. And even as grown adults, we're so nervous about talking about sex. And I think it comes back to that thing of, we're so stuffed up, because from the point of birth, like from being held as a baby, if we do anything sexual, usually the mother kind of freaks out and puts the baby down, or doesn't know what to do because she's not taught what to do. And so we get these messages from such a young age that sex is wrong, is taboo, anything sexual about us is sort of something to be hidden away. And it doesn't improve from there. You know, we go to school and No one's telling us this is a fantastic thing that you need to celebrate your body. So I think it comes back to that. You know, we could argue all the different systems, whether that's religion or government or those things that are keeping us like that. But it's not specific in my experience to the US. It's a issue any office I go or any place I go in the world, you know. We're still getting it, but it's changing. I don't know if you're seeing this in your practice, but I feel like out of the pandemic, out of the last couple of years from Me Too and Time's Up, like the conversations are opening up a little bit, you know, even the fact that I think it was a week ago, Gwyneth Paltrow came out with the vibrator, right? That wouldn't have happened even 5 years ago when I was starting out. That was no way was a celebrity going to have a sex toy brand, or we've seen all these celebrities joining sex toy brands as creative directors or things. So I think there's these little changes, often led by women, that open up the conversation, which are, you know, thank goodness, so overdue.
And I think part of it is also, and everyone in the space uses this expression, a rising tide raises all boats. There's more of us.
Yeah.
There's more people with capital. There's more people starting businesses. There are more people who are talking about this from whatever perspective they bring to it. And if we make progress at some point in my life, we will stop using the word taboo and sex and orgasm and anything in the same sentence, because we do have, certainly we each come with very different backgrounds. I've yet to hear the person who said, yes, I had a wonderful, open, complete, productive, you know, preparatory sex ed that has prepared me for all of life's challenges as it relates to my intimate life. You know, we're never hearing that. As they say, said no one ever. But to the extent that there's more conversation, and the pandemic with all the challenges has at least given rise to this broader conversation about the complexity of women's health, specifically the challenges and options, some of which you're working with companies to create for new ways to be connected and intimate.
Yeah, thank goodness, right? It was about time. It feels overdue.
It's funny. So again, I always go back to my practice and what I see on a day-to-day basis. And again, you know, realizing what kind of community I practice in and the demographics that I deal with. But it's funny that with all of this tech, I've never heard about so much loneliness when it comes to intimacy ever in my practice. And I'm lucky because I think my patients are pretty open and direct with me, especially since I bring that conversation up right away. What's your thought on that? Do you think tech has a role in creating this loneliness, or is it helping it?
Oh, it's such a good question, because it is so polarizing, right? Whenever we think about technology, I feel like I hear either people's hopes or it releases all these fears, and we're headed for this dystopia where technology is evil and going to replace us. And I think it does both. Is really the answer. Is like it's never going to be the utopia that we wish, but it does a good job of connecting people. But it's the humans that we so crave, right? And I think that idea of rip and replace and technology is going to, you know, we're going to all end up with, you know, robot girlfriends and robot boyfriends is kind of really far-fetched. I'm thinking about, well, actually, how can it serve intimacy and where are the gaps? So technology is good for connecting us like this and having conversations, but it's not good at replicating touch right now, you know, and that's something that I think through the pandemic has become so obvious in therapy rooms, right? Where this notion of skin hunger, where we're so starved of touch. Like, sure, you and I can chat on Zoom for hours, but what I want at the end of the day is a hug. And talking to sex therapists about, you know, the activities that they're suggesting, like giving yourself a hug, which, okay, it sounds ridiculous when you first hear it, but the science behind it and how it releases these emotions of just the feeling of being held. Like, that's something that, although in Japan at the moment, Gifu University created a robotic hand in the last couple of months. I don't know if you've seen this. It's a hand that warms and it grips, and it's just a hand. So it's kind of not as freaky as a full person or a doll. But out of this pandemic was like, people are really missing touch. And can technology provide that sort of touch and intimacy, or does it completely strip us of our humanity? And those questions are so interesting because we just don't know. And I think everyone just goes, no way. But right now, for the everyday person, we still need to be hugged by people. And I remember talking to a sex therapist about skin hunger, and she was saying, you know, what I do is I recommend people go out for a walk without their headphones, without their smartphone, and just look people in the eye, which again sounds ridiculous and freaky, but like that sort of thing we're missing is that humanity that intimacy brings.
And that basic human connection. And I do believe the skin hunger, when we come out of this, if and when we come out of this in whatever form it is, you know, the mental health issues that different groups of people will be experiencing, I think will be incredible. You know, I've spoken to a number of doctors who are treating women in menopause, and they say, you know, the thing they're most concerned about for whether it's whatever stage of life you're in, people living alone, is that that loneliness becomes almost palpable.
Yes. I mean, I'm alone right now, and I've seen one person in like 3 weeks, and it's very strange.
It's very strange.
Strange now, but you know what's strange? To think about socializing. I'm like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. You know,
so we've had these conversations in my family. You know, what's the first thing you're going to do when, or if, or you know, where are you going to go? Are you running naked through Times Square? And you know, most of the answers are just so basic. You just want to hug the people that you love.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is next in the video dating world or in the app, you know, dating world? Whether it's based on this pandemic or otherwise, what's new coming down the pike other than women being able to be the initiators?
So here's today's hot flash. Take a guess how many femtech companies there are out there. Per Femtech Focus, as of March 1st of this year, 2021, globally, there are 586 companies focused on femtech. This is astonishing.
Well, so it's interesting. So I think the video dating is now the new norm. That's not going away. So people have become really sort of dexterous in digital flirting, right? And virtual flirting, FaceTime dates before you meet up in person. Those things are sort of the new norm. And talking about this idea of like women initiating the contact, what's become a real problem and really obvious online and offline, but I think online's exacerbated it, is sexual harassment around these digital platforms. And so there's interesting innovations there. There's one called Ghostbot, which, you know, for, I think it's like 1 out of every 6 women experiences sexual harassment through dating, right? And I think it's 1 out of 6. It could be 5 out of 6, whatever it is. You know, like it's one of those stats that we all go, yeah, because we all know someone or we've all had it if we've been dating before. So Ghostbot is a thing that enables you can plug it into your phone, and it ghosts, so it lets go of someone that you don't have to do the emotional labor with, that may have a text exchange that may have turned unsavory, you know, through the course of the thing. Maybe it's a dick pic, maybe it's someone that's really pressing you to meet up. And there is a certain level of work and emotion that goes into letting that person go gently rather than that risk of them turning violent, which violence in digital spaces can be and can feel as violating as in person. So these sort of innovations are interesting, where people are going, well, how do we combat this kind of new problem we have with apps, which is it just turns awful and it turns us off. Well, then they add an extension onto it, and then you go, okay, Ghostbot, do your thing, and it, you know, goes off and has this emotionally intelligent conversation with this person. So those sorts of things are coming. I think people are really struggling also with doing more digital dates, you know, virtual dating. Back to Rachel's point, like, oh my God, I just want to touch a person or see a person. And I think there's going to be this movement back to, you know, matchmaking and, you know, almost outsourcing that swipe and everything to someone that can really know you, in that level of like customization, personalization that seems really hot anyway in tech.
That is an amazing idea. I always go back to the smells. Like, people are so sensitive to smells. So,
Right.
and you know, there's a role for pheromones with attraction, of course. So I just, you know, noticed that that's missing in the video dating world, but I guess takes
Yeah.
hold once you get through your first video date.
Yeah.
I have to ask, so again, in my practice, the biggest complaint and the most complex thing that I have to manage is somebody who likes to get involved with the sexual health of my patients is libido. So libido, it's a huge complaint. There's so many variables that go into this.
Yeah.
And, of course, if it's a relationship problem, like that's just off base for me. That's
Right.
mental health field. And I happily refer those people out. But what's coming down the pike to spark up the libido for, let's just say, women, because I'm a gynecologist, who maybe are very happy, but they've been in a 30-year relationship, so they feel a little bored or like they're in a rut. Or for maybe the person who, isn't that thrilled with their weight or their appearance, so their sexual self-esteem is a little altered.
Right.
What's coming down the tech pipe for these types of things?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that education is better around libido now too, and thinking in understanding for people that libido and sex drive just fluctuate over the course of your life, over the course of months, weeks, even a night, right? And so that, I think, we're getting more education, and that's not an advanced technology, but it may be delivered by, Instagram. But I think there's a more of a normalization now for people, which is accessible, going on Instagram and realizing this is not a me issue. There's not something wrong with me. But in terms of like spicing up your relationship, I think that there's really fun stuff like the audio erotica tools we've seen, like Dipsy and Quinn and things that are more geared towards women because they're oral and not visual, and things that tend to arouse women. We take a bit longer usually, right, to warm up to those sorts of things, and different ways, and recognizing, it's not just porn or it's not just straight through it. Like foreplay is so important. And to the educational point around libido, I think apps like Lover and Furly that are like educational apps for adults, right, around this sort of stuff. How do I talk to my partner about sex drive? How do I improve my sex drive? Are actually making a difference too. I mean, they're not the most far out thing. It's really just videos inside an app, but for some reason it really resonates because it's so private. Our smartphone's essentially another limb at this point. Having that on your phone, I think, helps. And then I'm trying to think of like some really fun far out ones, because one thing I know is Lovehoney did this survey over the first 4 months of lockdown. I don't know if you know it, and it had 54% of couples became more sexually adventurous during quarantine, and everyone's like, well, what was everyone doing? How are they becoming more adventurous? And look, the media will report 600% increase in sex toys, so people were definitely buying toys. I think they were buying teledildonics, and connecting apps even in different rooms. But I think people were just hungry to try something different, and imagination is like, well, you can definitely find ideas on the internet.
Well, going back to the same side, different sides of the same coin, does it create intimacy? Does it interfere with intimacy? We heard from just as many people that when you ask them how their behavior had changed, Lovehoney survey said 54% were having more. There was a whole large group of people who were having way less because the anxiety, whether it was emotional or financial or, physical distance, were having a lot less. So just like anything else in intimacy, there's a wide range. So I want to go from, you came up with this idea, you said there's no conversation, I'm going to create this podcast, Future of Sex. You exploded and talked around the world. And then you said, okay, my next gig, in addition to all this, is I'm going to start a school for entrepreneurs in sex tech. So how did that start, and where are you? How many classes have you had? How many semesters have there been? And what are you learning from the companies that you bring in?
Yeah, so I started that honestly because people were messaging me going, how do I get started in sex tech? And I'd seen so many innovations, and I'd also run hackathons, these weekend-long innovation jams around the world, and realized so many people have great ideas because of the shitty experiences that they've had, whether that was painful sex or, unfortunately, like assault, harassment. And the issue was they didn't know how to get started because you can't really Google that much around sex tech getting started, and they just were like, well, where do I go? And so that birthed this school where I thought, well, I've got 5 years now, I know where the community is, I know the sort of ins and outs and the quirks of building brand in the space, and from my background in tech and doing business modeling, I brought that into the school. And so that started in June last year as a test cohort to see, look, all these people have sent me emails, let's see if they show up, and let's see what they've got. And we had entrepreneurs, we had people that just were sick, mid-career, and were like, I'm sick of what I'm doing, I want to change, I want something more meaningful. And, it was majority women, surprise, surprise, that showed up and built these businesses that changed their careers and worked on prototypes to launch, whether that was a sexting app, whether that was like a smart strap-on, there were, DIY vibrator workshops. There was so many interesting, exciting ideas that I felt like they just needed a bit of encouragement, a bit of industry knowledge, and also the resources to know where to look for capital, because it is so hard, right, in this industry to try and raise money from a bunch of dudes and talking about vaginas. It's like, well, here's what you need to know to try and get that moolah. So now we've done 4 cohorts. It's been incredible. We've had people from all over the world join, from Brazil to Hong Kong, and I'm about to relaunch in April with a much bigger cohort and a lot more guest speakers. Perhaps I'll try and convince you two to come on as guest speakers, and teach them a thing or two. And also it's about building community, which we know is so important in this industry when you're brave enough to do something that is a risk, and it comes with a lot of strange faces from family or friends or even partners going, what the hell are you doing? You need that support network that are going and cheering you on and going, keep going. So
absolutely. And there's so many, I mean, you've been part of this, I've been part of this. There's so many organizations now focused on this space. But one of the things that continues to please me is how generous and collaborative the people in this space are. Don't have the same battle scars that I do. Here's what went wrong for me. Try this. And, you'll still hit some road bumps, but hopefully they'll be smaller and less painful and shorter in terms of getting from here to there.
Yeah. It's such a unique industry in that way. I feel like it's also just, the quality, I think, of bringing a lot of women together in a space where we've felt very small for a while, building something and also crashing through some pretty big walls together is really exciting. And I would agree, like companies that previously in other industries we consider were competitors, 2 sex toy brands, or 2 vibrator companies banding together. We've seen this with, Dame and Unbound organizing protests and stuff. It is really unique in that way and really special to be a part of.
I was telling Allysa today that the protest that I went to that I think you organized, or maybe Dame and Unbound organized.
Yeah, they did.
That was so my, I've been in women's health for a long time, and that was the first time I've ever been at a protest. But it was amazing to see, the shapes and sizes, the geographies, the age ranges, the genders represented. It was really an unbelievable intersection of all the people who want to have a voice in this space. So this is a hard question, I'm sure, to answer, but with your soothsayer future of sex viewpoint, looking out in the next couple of years, are there a couple of trends or areas that you think will explode or explode even more than they have during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're seeing this area around women's sexual health branded as wellness, which is great, I think, which is exploding right now. Behind that, I think, comes a whole lot of interesting little subcultures, subsets that have previously been invisible, marginalized, ignored. Good example of that is the disabled community, where, Handy, we've seen a new prototype for a sex toy designed by disabled people for the disabled community, specifically with hand limitations that, they can't touch themselves. A sex toy is going to be of no use. So I think that's a really exciting and untapped market. Previously, communities like that had weak hands, that suffered from that, would have to hire a sex worker, which gets expensive, complicated depending on what country you're in, or they go without, which sounds really crappy. Another example of that is, I think, the VDOM. I don't know if you've seen this smart wearable prosthetic that for lesbians, even paraplegics or people suffering from premature ejaculation, wearing a prosthetic is kind of amazing, where, usually if they wanted to have sex, they'd have a sex toy, but to move about in the world and feel that, they'd still have to wear a sex toy, which is like, I'm wearing a device designed for orgasm, you know, as I get on the subway or go about my grocery shopping, doesn't really give you that sense of sexual expression that you're so craving. So I think that's also really exciting. So I think in the wake of all these trailblazing women of sex tech that have created these companies is all these other really interesting communities that have been ignored too, that now are sort of rising up. And of course, behind that, we need to stop the stigma around men using sex toys too. And what celebrity is going to come out? We need to nominate a celebrity to come out and talk about male masturbation as a healthy, important practice for their sexual wellness too.
I think that's got a little ways to go.
It feels like at the last of the line.
So I want to wrap this up, but I am sort of curious, what is either the wildest or the most impactful device that you have come across in your travels?
Yeah, you know, like, I hate to be cliche, but I think it has to come down to sex robots, right? And I was traveling with Harmony AI, which is a robot / doll, originally a doll, now a robot, that comes with an app and literally has technology inside her head. And so we did this talk with Harmony, and we took her to, I think it was Romania, Lithuania, and we had her on stage, and it was just totally bizarre to me. We took her heads on the plane in a briefcase, and you know, the heads came out, and I was like, oh my God, this is actually real. And then talking to her and interviewing her, which was incredibly clunky, and like, it was like, whew, you know, she got fired up and her eyes opened and she moved around, and I had that moment where I was like, oh my God, this is the future. And then, you know, she stuttered and you know, couldn't string a sentence together. I'm like, oh, we're good. But that was one of those surreal moments where it was like facing what initially I thought was the future of sex, and was a wild experience. Whereas honestly today, when we think about all this technology that we're using, it's often not that sophisticated or complex, right? It's really simple stuff that is actually making the most impact.
I will have a lot more to talk about in about a year, I would imagine.
Yes.
Very interesting. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast at businessofthev.com for the latest trends and trendsetters in women's health and business.